This is Reality Dispatch by Jim Minns.
The room was danky and cold, and the floor was still sticky from whatever was spilt on the carpet the night before. But when Miles walked in and took his seat in front of Pedro, the room suddenly grew warm and was verging on hot. It was February and a gale blew outside, but that didn't matter. Miles's ego was enough to make the candles spark. Pedro had already set up the dictaphone in anticipation of Mr. Davis's arrival, but now that he was facing him and the intensity of his eyes, even if they were behind shades, he worried that something wasn't right. Perhaps the levels were off, or the battery might need a last-minute change, or the mic that tapered off with a lead would crackle for the first time and make the entire conversation not fit to air. Miles was the world's greatest jazz musician, some would say greatest musician. Period. Pedro thought this would be a breeze, but his pulse told another story. "I'm ready, let's talk," Miles began as he lit a cigarette as effortlessly as the click of a finger. It wasn't until a second later that Pedro realized a member of Miles' crew lit the joint with a Zippo that appeared out of the shadows. Miles looked into the ceiling as he breathed in the smoke, his husky voice characteristic of a man who was accustomed to the use of his vocal cords, not just for communicating words, but also his soul. Well, first, let me begin by thanking you for appearing on the NPR Jazz Hour. It is a real honor to have you on the show, Mr. Davis, Pedro began. Miles nodded. Pedro cleared his throat to buy him some time before he had to ask his first question, realizing he had forgotten his train of thought. Miles sat patiently awaiting the line of inquiry, but it was the crew behind him that showed the first signs of restlessness. There were words muttered under breaths, and Pedro felt the first dabs of sweat trickle down his forehead as his cheeks flushed a hot chili. Miles sat there, his eyes hidden under his dark sunglasses. If he was pissed off at the prolonged process, his demeanor didn't show it. The silence grew so long and went on for what seemed like an eternity that Pedro felt no other option than to issue an apology. "Don't mention it, my man," Miles said with the cool tone of a crooning solo. Nothing was chasing him. Pedro couldn't stand that he was keeping the great man waiting with his immaturity, the obnoxiousness of forgetting what questions to ask a major player on the jazz scene, to be broadcast on the longest-running American jazz show in history. If he died right then, satisfaction at his failure would be achieved for. It would be a worthy and noble death. "My man, what is the problem?" Miles stated rather than asking. "I'm sorry, Mr. Davis. You're not sorry. You're in a funk," Miles said. The great man then leaned forward and removed his glasses. His piercing eyes cut through Pedro's shell-shocked gaze, like a laser through a glass door. "You're thinking about me, my crew, this place, your equipment, the show, your reputation." Pedro looked down at his dictaphone, the tape spurning over with useless recordings. He looked up at Miles and nodded. "I don't want to hear a polished question. I wouldn't have said yes to this if I knew you were going to sit there and give me your idea of what a perfect interview is. I want you to close your eyes. Do it. Right now." Pedro did as he was told. "Do you know how to talk, my man?" Miles asked. Pedro nodded. "Yes." Miles sat back in his chair and reapplied his sunnies. "You're floating above the Chicago skyline right now. I want you to look down. Tell me what you see." Pedro let his mind go to the place that Miles directed him. He looked down using his imagination. "I don't know," he said. Miles slapped him in the face. "Yes, you do." Miles pointed at a startled Pedro. "Close your goddamn eyes again, go the fuck back into the sky, look down one street below, and you tell me what the fuck you see," he demanded. Pedro closed his eyes and did as he was told. He was shaking and more nervous than when the conversation began. "Well," Miles demanded. "People, I see people," Pedro answered. "Pick a person and tell me about them," Miles asked. Pedro described a Mexican girl in a green dress, walking along with a bouquet in her hand. "Left hand or right hand?" Miles demanded to know. "Right hand," Pedro answered. Miles clicked his fingers, and his trumpet appeared in his lap. He placed the instrument to his lips and began to play. Miles's soul transcended through the tube and illuminated the room like the sun casting rays on a Cuban beach just before it was about to set on a couple proposing marriage to one another. The joyful moment when they accept what is on offer, and the bitter aftertaste as fate would have another plan for them. one filled with pain and regret. It was all there in the music as Miles outlined the course of life in the only way he knew how. When he was done, he handed the instrument over his shoulder to be collected by hands that had appeared out of the shadows. "Oh, what was that?" Pedro asked in awe. "I hadn't heard that one before." "No one has," Miles began. "That was the first time I'd ever played that song. Before we met, that song didn't exist," Miles explained as he stood. "Remember, my man, life is life, and it's hard. But what you need to do is tap into the windows that are out there, beyond the soul. They will show you what you need." Pedro nodded to Miles as he stood from his seat, realizing his time with the man had come to an end. "What else was the Mexican girl wearing?" Miles asked. "Red shoes," Pedro explained. "You can thank the window into the other realm for showing you that. It's what shows me what to play. It's what tells me what to say and what to think," Miles said. He then turned from Pedro and proceeded up the stairs and out of the club, disappearing into the afternoon sun. Pedro looked down at his dictaphone, saying a silent prayer that everything had been captured and praying that the audio was of a quality worthy of broadcast.
For more stories of fact-based fiction, head to jimmins.substack.com.